Welcome to Tuesday's edition of Renew Plus. I'm Pastor Tony. Thank you for joining us again today. Again, we're in week number 9 of our rest area we've entitled Just As If Sin Never Existed. If you missed yesterday, I encourage you strongly to go back and listen to yesterday, maybe before you even hear today. We just can't go over everything I said yesterday. But we're talking about this week and probably into next week as we finish up this series, believing just as if sin never existed in our life. And I'll tell you, that takes the fences of limitation down in our life. Now let's look back over to Mark chapter 9 once again. Mark chapter 9 and get our key verse that we looked at yesterday. And we'll see that the statement that I just made right there is indeed backed up. In fact, it was founded on what Jesus said here in Mark 9:23. Mark 9:23, Jesus said to him, talking about the father of that child who he brought to Jesus in order to get delivered, Jesus said to him, "If you can believe." Now this is in response to what the father had said to him before that. He said, "Jesus, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." But notice that what Jesus said is, he responded to that saying, "If you can believe." See, the man was thinking, if you can do anything, and Jesus said, if you can believe. Now notice, if you can believe, all things are possible to him that believes. Now everyone has that realm of possibility where they believe that things are possible to them, based on what they can do, based on their resources, available to them, based on maybe what the bank can loan them, based on what the government can do, based on what man-made institutions can do. But this is not really what he's talking about here, because when Jesus said, if you can believe, all things are possible to him. That kind of believing in self, believing in man, believing in money, believing in natural resources, and what we can do by our own ability and strength and power, that would make some things possible in our thinking, in our believing, but not all things possible. Notice that Jesus said, if you can believe, all things are possible. So he's talking about believing in something beyond ourselves, beyond what we can do, beyond what man and man-made institutions can do, what natural means we have available to us. He's talking about reaching over, knocking the fences of limitation down, and getting out into the realm where all things are possible. And notice how we come to that place where all things are in the realm of possibility to us is by believing the right thing, believing in the right person. See, we have to get the focus and the trust, the dependence off of us, off of self, off of man, off of natural things, and we need to put it back over where it belongs, on God. God wants to be the Most High in our life. He is the Most High, but he wants to be the Most High in our life. He wants us to look to him as the Most High, as the Almighty. See, that if you really think about God and you really believe in God, and you believe that he created everything, you can just kind of look around at the stars and everything he created and come to the conclusion that nothing's really too hard for God. If he created all this, he can take care of us. But most of the time, we're still looking at ourselves. We're still looking at men. We're still looking at natural resources in order to create our realm of possibility. But Jesus said, you're going to have to believe outside of yourself. Believe outside of man and natural stuff. And when you begin to believe toward God, when you put your belief in God, then all things become possible to him who believes. Now, notice on down to verse 24, and immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." Now, what does he mean by that? Well, first of all, the man was being honest, wasn't he? God can deal with honesty. Somebody said, God can meet you where you are, but he can't meet you where you pretend to be. That's a great statement. But I want you to see right here, it says, he said, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." See, how can you believe and still have unbelief? Well, you can still believe in your heart and still have unbelief and doubt in your head. See, that's what was going on right here. Because of this man's experiences, his past experiences of disappointment, See, the enemy, our adversary, that is the devil. There is a devil, and he's our adversary. God is not our adversary. He's not the one working against us. He is for us, not against us. But there is an adversary out there. His name is Satan, who tries to work against us. And he likes to train people in disappointments. He tries to get them to look at all these past experiences where things fail, where they were disappointed, and create fences of possibility and impossibility in their life. See, the fence line really is the drawing line between what you believe to be possible and what is outside of that realm of possibility, what we would call the impossible. And see, what the enemy wants to do is create narrow fence lines, short ceilings, and small borders and boundaries in our life. Why is that? He wants to keep us corralled in a small quadrant off area. Why? So he can control us. So he can dominate us. So he can keep us out from going in and possessing our inheritance, our promised land, and having the blessing of God beginning to manifest in our life. And see, all these things that we talked about over the last number of weeks about the blessing of God and restoration and being redeemed from the curse, all these are appropriated and activated in our life through faith. He wants to keep our faith in ourselves. He wants to keep our believing and our trust in men, natural resources. That way he can kind of control what we're doing. You know, the thing about this is, you know, I've heard a lot of Christians, I've been pastoring for a number of years, they say, well, you know, the devil said this to me and he did this to me and blah, blah, blah. It's like he personally had something to do with him. I can tell you he probably didn't. In fact, once the enemy begins to build those fence lines in your own life, in your own heart, then he doesn't have to even personally mess with you anymore. He can just kind of leave you alone, and you'll kind of stay within that fence line. You'll stay within that corral that he has created for you to be in, that realm of possibility, those limitations that are created on the inside of you. Now, how does he do this? Well, again, past experiences, failures, disappointments. Well, I prayed about that, and people blame God, and they said, well, God didn't answer. Well, maybe you didn't receive it. Maybe you didn't do what the Word said about praying, believing, and receiving when you pray. You know, your faith has something to do with receiving from God. It's not just God the giving end, and I can tell you there is nothing wrong with the giving end. But there can definitely be some things wrong in the receiving end. You know, if it didn't just quite work out, we need to just step up to the lick log, so to speak. That's kind of a southern colloquial expression. And just be honest and say, well, you know what? I really had a lot of doubts. I had a lot of unbelief. This is what this man was saying right here. He was just being honest. Sometimes we need to do that. In fact, before we can overcome and begin to tear down those fences, we need to at least find out where they came from and how to get rid of them. But this man said, Lord, I believe. He believed what Jesus just said right there. He believed. He was latching on to what Jesus just said right there. But then he said, Lord, help my unbelief. In other words, he was still struggling with getting rid of those fences inside of him to reach over and believe for something impossible, something that had never happened before in his life. Again, he'd been down this road of disappointment so many times. It created that stronghold of unbelief and failure inside of him. It created that fence, that realm of possibility where he thought, it's just not possible. I guess this is an impossibility. Even though he heard about Jesus and his disciples, he probably came with some expectation that, you know, for his son being delivered by his disciples based on what he had heard from them. But then all of a sudden the same thing happened. And so you can see where he was just desperate right here. He said, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Well, Jesus took his belief and he did help his unbelief. Thank God for that. You know, God will help us, but sometimes we just admit it. We have to have some form of belief down there. We have to have some kind of faith working. We have to be believing, at least in our hearts, something about what Jesus is saying right here. But you know what? If you're having unbelief and doubts up here, you're still struggling with those fences, I believe that God will help you even though you still have a fence there. And he did here. He went on and cast that spirit out of that boy, and he was delivered that day. I'll tell you that the conclusion came out right. Now, I want to go over to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17, because there's another end to this story. And it has to do with the disciples who tried to cast that spirit out of this boy, but could not. And so they came privately after this had all happened. The boy was delivered. The crowd had been dispersed. They came privately to Jesus because they had been involved in casting out spirits and healing the sick and doing miracles up until this point. But boy, they hit a wall. They hit a fence line right here of impossibility in their life. And so they came to Jesus, Matthew chapter 17, verse 20, and they asked, or verse 19, the disciples came to him privately and said, why could we not cast that spirit out? Well, that's a good question. I'm glad his disciples asked questions. They didn't just stay quiet in the corner, and trying to save face. I'm glad they didn't do that. I'm glad they asked questions because Jesus was able to answer their question. But I can tell you, we come up against the same kind of thing right here. We can say, Lord, why didn't it work? We're so quick to blame God sometimes for failures, for not receiving, not having things, not having answered prayer, and we don't really ask God, well, why didn't it happen? Because sometimes we're really not ready for the answer. But you got to be ready for the answer. But notice what Jesus said to them right there. Now, he didn't beat around the bush with it. He didn't try to sugarcoat it. He just simply said in verse 20, Jesus said to them, based on their question, why couldn't we cast it out? He says, because of your unbelief. Notice what he had said to that man earlier. He said, if you can believe, all things are possible. Well, what if you can't believe? Well, then you have a small realm of possibility where you have a fence of limitation. Where you get outside of that fence, it becomes impossible. In fact, you can't believe for it. This is what was going on here. He said, because of your unbelief. Your unbelief. In other words, you had a fence there. You had a border, a boundary, a short ceiling there that prevented you from using your faith, like in other cases, in this situation, in order to cast that spirit out. Now again, they have done this in other situations, but if you read that story about that demon-possessed boy that we just read there, Mark chapter 9, you find out that whenever they tried to cast that spirit out, and they tried to do this, that demonic spirit tried to do this with Jesus. He put on kind of a song and dance, a dog and pony show, I like to say. He calls that boy to lay on the ground and wallow and foam at the mouth, and then he became rigid. I mean, he's putting on a big show here. Why? Because he's wanting to move people by what they're seeing. He's wanting to get them off of their faith and believe that this is an impossibility based on what I'm seeing right here. Now, his disciples weren't mature enough, developed enough in their faith at this point, and gotten rid of enough of that unbelief out, torn down those fences. They were moved by what they saw. They were moved by this dog and pony show that this demonic spirit was carrying on right in the midst of them. But I want you to see that Jesus wasn't moved by it. Why? Because his basis for belief was not in the natural realm. It was in God and in the kingdom of God and in the power of God. And that demonic spirit was no match for the power of God. But in their mind, in the disciples' mind, it was. And so it became a fence. It caused them to be an unbelief. So Jesus said, it's because of your unbelief. For assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain. In other words, it doesn't require a whole lot of faith, but it does require pure faith. It does require faith that's not contaminated by doubt and unbelief. Now notice, he said, if you had faith as a mustard seed, you would say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Now I want you to see what else Jesus said here. And nothing will be impossible for you. So notice, he said the same thing to them that he did to that boy's father. If you can believe, all things are possible. If you use your faith and even speak to mountains, without doubting, without having unbelief present, pure, incorruptible faith, then what happens? Then things move, things happen, things respond to our faith, things respond to the way we believe, and nothing will be impossible for you. In other words, what Jesus is doing is challenging those fence lines in their life. He said, if you get rid of those fence lines of unbelief, that realm of possibility, that realm of limitations that have been created in your own mind and heart, then you can move out with your faith into the realm where there are no fences, boundaries, and borders. There are no ceilings, where the sky's the limit, so to speak, and that was created by God and still expanding at the speed of light, by the way. He said you move out into the realm where all things are possible to you. Now, how can I get to that point? Well, I'm out of time today. I'm going to have to pick it up tomorrow. This is going to take 2 weeks to get through this. We're going to talk about how to get rid of those fences in your life, those fences of limitation, and move out into the realm where you can believe and all things become possible to you. That is New Covenant living, by the way. Well, that's all the time I've got for today. If you'd like additional materials, go to tonycowan.org. We'll see you tomorrow.